Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to each of the witnesses. Many judges across the country follow a straightforward mode of constitutional interpretation that is looking to the original public meaning of constitutional language. Original public meaning posits that the object of interpretation is the constitutional or statutory text as reasonably understood by the American people at the time of the provision's enactment. The ERA resolution was passed out of Congress in 1972, and it had a clear and unambiguous deadline. Every person in this room understands what that deadline was. And in 1972, every person understood it as well. In this Congress, I've reintroduced legislation that did not pass in the preceding Congress. I'm quite confident Chairman Durbin has reintroduced legislation in this Congress that did not pass in the previous Congress. Why do we have to do that? Because there's a deadline. When the previous Congress expired, legislation you introduced in the previous Congress is no longer before the Congress. Now, it's not only those of us in the room who understood the deadline to mean what the deadline actually says. In 1978, Congress passed a resolution extending the ratification deadline until 1982. If the original deadline wasn't valid, there would have been no need to extend it to 1982. And even judges who don't subscribe to originalism acknowledge the obvious reality. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a trailblazing advocate, said the following about the Equal Rights Amendment in 2019, quote, "The ERA fell 3 states short of ratification. I hope someday it will be put back in the political hopper, starting over again, collecting the necessary number of states to ratify it." Professor Foley, what was the Corwin Amendment?
Corwin Amendment was an amendment that would have basically prohibited Congress from, or the states from, well, Congress specifically, from messing with slavery.
And are there states that have attempted to rescind their earlier approval of the Corwin Amendment?
Yes, several.
So Maryland in 2014, Illinois in 2022?
Mm-hmm.
It would seem that legislators from those states, Illinois in particular, want to have their cake and eat it too. On one hand, they want to say, in the ERA context, that a state cannot rescind its previous ratification. But at the same time, they want to be able to rescind their own ratification and conclude that doing so is perfectly permissible when it concerns a different topic, when it concerns slavery. Are those two positions consistent?
Don't seem consistent to me.
Professor Foley, have other constitutional amendments contained deadlines?
Sure. Every constitutional amendment since the 18th Amendment has contained a deadline, except for the 19th, which is gender voting rights.
So 8 of the last 9 amendments have had deadlines?
Yes.
Is there Supreme Court precedent that deals with Congress's ability to include a deadline when it provides instructions for ratification?
Yeah, absolutely. Dillon v. Gloss and Coleman versus Miller.
Ms. Braceras, good to see you. Welcome. You and I were
Nice
classmates
in
law
Senator.
school. Good to see you. Let me ask you, when the original version of the ERA was introduced, what was the state of the law concerning discrimination against women, and what protections are there to protect women against discrimination today?
It was very different. When it was introduced in the House first in 1971, and at that point the Supreme Court had not yet decided Reed versus Reed, which is the famous case brought by the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg that established that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment prohibits government from treating similarly situated men and women differently. So that had not been decided. when the ERA was first introduced. There were a lot of other things, laws that had not been passed to protect women. Pregnancy
so there are today vigorous protections against gender discrimination. And let me ask you...
Both constitutional and statutory.
Since my time has expired, let me just ask you, what are some of the potential consequences for American society if the ERA were ratified now into the Constitution?
Well, I think one very important thing is that the meaning of the word sex was quite clear in 1971. Today, there are many people who are trying to argue that the word sex also includes gender identity. And so...
Including the Supreme Court in Bostock.
Right. So if the ERA were to be passed today, it would open up a whole host of areas to private women's spaces to men who identify as women.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from Concerned Women of America concerning this amendment.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Senator Ossoff.